Good morning, everyone. It's Susan Jebb here. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. My video won't start, but if somebody could just pop a little message in the text to say you can hear me. Emma, thank you. That's great. Well, you can live without seeing me, so I'm just going to say a few words before we get started for real. Mostly, I want to say a really warm welcome to the 4th LEAP conference. So over the years, this meeting has built up a bit of a following, and today we're expecting over 200 people to join us at some point. We had hoped until quite late in the day that we'd hold this meeting in person, but in the end, we felt that that wasn't the right decision. And rather than grapple with the complexities of hybrid working, we are this year, for the second time, completely online. On the positive side, it does allow colleagues from as far away as Australasia, Africa, and America to join us. And a particular welcome to those people who've either stayed up very late or had to get up very early to join us on UK time today. But there is something about the energy and connections of a meeting in person that I'm really missing. And so at risk of repeating the comments I made last year, we do very much hope to welcome you to Oxford for LEAP 2022. I'm going to have one more go at starting. I think you may have video now. This year, recognising the sort of fatigue that comes from online meetings, we've kept the live presentations a little bit shorter than usual. We've also got 2 fabulous keynote speakers who I'm sure are going to give very stimulating presentations, and a whole series of talks about new work from around the world. I hope you'll also take some time to look at the posters and do get involved in the discussions and in chatting with each other throughout the morning. And I hope the online platform will make that relatively easy for you. You can ask questions live in the Q&A sessions at the end, or you can email attendees or speakers directly. And we really do want to encourage people to use this as an opportunity to network with colleagues. We're going to be recording the live sessions, and these will be posted on the online platform by the end of the week. And you'll be able to access the conference for a few months to continue networking with other delegates and with the LEAP team. It's been a busy year actually for LEAP, and you will hear some of the work we've been doing presented today. But this conference has always really been a time for us to hear from you. And so we've limited the amount of LEAP work that's actually going to be presented in the meeting. And we'd really encourage you to look at what we've been up to on our website. I do, however, want to make special mention of a major public engagement exhibition we've been running, which is currently on show at the Natural History Museum in Oxford. It's called Meet Your Future, and it really showcases a lot of the work that the LEAP team have been up to. It was due to finish in January, but I'm delighted to say it's been so successful, it's going to run until next May. You can also access a series of talks, conversations, debates, and other events which have been organised by the museum in parallel with the exhibition, and details of those are on the museum website. But today we really want to focus on hearing from other people and learning about the wider landscape concerning livestock, environment, and people. It's been a busy time. There have been some important initiatives at both national and international level, from the publication of the National Food Strategy in England to big international events such as the Nutrition for Growth Summit and COP26 last month. So to get the day started, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Judith Batchelar. Judith has spent her whole career in the food and drink industry, first in manufacturing before moving into retail. And I think I've known Judith the whole time that I've been working in this field. For the last 17 years, she's been director of the Sainsbury's brand, just stepping down a couple of weeks ago. In that role, she's been responsible for all aspects of Sainsbury's product offer, from policy issues such as ethical and sustainable sourcing, through product technology, and right on to corporate responsibility and public affairs. She has incredibly deep insights into how these businesses run. She's given so much to the food sector throughout her career, and she was awarded an OBE for services to farming in the food industry. And she's commissioner on the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. She's also chaired the government's Agri-Tech Council and now sits on both the Food and Drink Sector Council, and she's a non-exec of the Environment Agency. Amidst all that, and I honestly don't know how she does it, she still finds time to work as chair of the Rugby Players Association, which I know is a huge passion of hers. And she's a trustee of the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew and an ambassador for the Woodland Trust. Judith, really fabulous to have you here. I'm just sorry it's not in person because it would be lovely to catch up. I know what deep insights you've got into the food system, from health to sustainability. And I think what you'll bring to our meeting today is something of the perspective from both the supply chain, but also from consumers. So I'm really delighted that you've agreed to join us and look forward to hearing your talk to launch this 2021 LEAP conference. Thank you.
Brilliant. And thank you, Susan. I'm hoping, says the host has stopped my video. So I'm hoping the host will unlock my video now. Can you hear me, anybody out there?
Judith, we can hear you absolutely fine. I think if you unclick your video there, you're in business, and I'll turn myself off. The world only needs one of us at a time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susan. Seriously, thank you, Susan, for inviting me to come along, and good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world today. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so sharing with you some insights around the wonderful food and farming system that we're all part of. And I'm hopeful that that will stimulate lots of thoughts and questions. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yeah, that's
have a
great.
Thumbs up. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And what I really wanted to talk about today was the challenge around healthy and sustainable diets and how we get from knowing to doing. And I say that because it's something that I've worked on for nearly 40 years. And over that time, it has evolved enormously in terms of what we mean by a healthy and sustainable diet. But the one thing that we all struggle with is getting from the knowledge to the implementation and doing that in a way that has real impact. And the first thing for me to say is that this isn't just something for retailers, for manufacturers, for farmers and growers. It is the full system. And it's only a systems-based approach to sustainability, the challenges and opportunities that that brings, that really will shift this massive global system. And why do we need to do that? Well, I think it's pretty obvious to all of you, and it's why you're part of the work that LEAP are doing. But our current food practices really do not meet the demands of the future. And in fact, you could argue that they don't really meet the demands of today. And for us, that's really important. But sorry, I go back a slide. It doesn't matter which lens you look through, whether it's the lens of plastic pollution, the lens of biodiversity, the lens of fresh water, greenhouse gas emissions, the way that we feed ourselves, the food that we waste, so on and so forth. Whatever lens you look through, this system needs a major transformation. And in order to do that, we need to have the system in the room. And it's easy to say, but it's much more difficult to define, particularly, I don't know in your experience, but my experience, whenever I talk to somebody about something, we always end the meeting with, by the way, the person you really need to speak to is X or Y, or if you haven't met these people, they've got a really interesting perspective on this. So as I'm saying this, I'm conscious that putting your arms around the scope of the system isn't necessarily as easy as we all think it is, but working hard to really define that system and those system stakeholders is key. And at the same time, as well as defining the system, we have to define the enabling environment that that system needs to thrive. And I mean thrive in the broadest sense. And whether that is the funding that comes from governments, whether that's the skills that the sector needs, whether that's having a sector that's ready for new science and new thinking, whether that's engaging consumers or supply chain partners, or indeed in trying to influence policymakers. If any of those things are missing, it's highly unlikely that we'll be able to drive the system change that we need to see. And I talk about that up front in a bit of detail, because I think at COP26, the one thing that came out for me, and I was lucky enough to be there for most of the 2 weeks, wasn't just the campaigning of the youth and the Greta Thunbergs, but actually a broader sense of frustration with the system, that the system has not been moving fast enough and at great enough pace and scale to be able to remedy some of the things that the system has created. And I think that's partly true, but I think it's like all of these things, nothing is quite as it appears on the surface. And one of the things that we haven't been able to do well is to show the progress that we have been making, and to make greater progress, and the progress that we would all like to see, that for most of us on this meeting today won't be at big enough scale and won't be, say, fast enough. So on the basis that there's a view of inaction on our part, how do we approach that? And I like to think of this, and somebody said to me the other day, this isn't new thinking, Judith. Socrates talked about the gap between knowing and doing, not quite those words, but the fact is we all might think that we're aligned on what we know needs to be done, but there is a frustration that we don't do it. And how do we deal with that? Because policy is great, great research and academic thinking is great, but if we don't deliver it and implement it well, then it's almost irrelevant, and we don't want that to happen. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these slides in great detail, but I think you can think about this in two ways. The first way, and actually this is probably the most important, is really knowing what it is that we want to do. And that means defining the system, as I've talked about. It means providing great quality information and knowledge, establishing understanding and gaining commitment. But in order to do that, it takes a lot of time and hard work. And quite often, this is the bit that we shortcut, because we're talking to each other, and sometimes it's that lovely echo chamber where we all nod and we all think we're using the same words with the same meaning. We all think we have the same degree of base knowledge and understanding of quite complex scientific issues, but quite often we don't. And when we don't get that right, and we don't spend enough time and effort on making that a really formal part of the process, then delivering those things and turning what tends to be best practice into common practice doesn't often happen. And that's the green side of the chart, with things like building new business systems and processes, standardizing metrics and reporting, setting KPIs, setting targets and incentives, so on and so forth. What I wanted to do was unpick this a little with the view of healthy and sustainable diets. So when we start to think about the gap between knowing and doing, and what defining and aligning the system members means, what do we really mean? And it's the things I just talked about: identifying the system, identifying the scope and the priorities, establishing the understanding, and gaining what I would call not just a coalition of the willing, but those that are committed to taking action too. And somebody said to me the other day, we need to stop talking about things and these think tanks, and we need to establish some do tanks. I thought that was a good way of describing it, but definitely coalitions of the willing have moved to coalitions of action and coalitions of the ambitious. In my world, that means, how do we push on leadership through the best understanding and the best science? And the UK is brilliant at that. how do we reframe some of these internal and external communications? I'll give you a good example. We didn't get much traction talking to consumers about food waste when we talked about a campaign we ran called Waste Less, Save More. When we started to talk to consumers about food waste and climate change, suddenly the traction, the relevance, and the way that it resonated with them took that whole conversation around food waste to a different level. Repurposing our existing commitments, what does that mean on things like deforestation and animal feed, for example? And in terms of pushing that forward for a business like the businesses I've worked with, thinking about who is advising us as a business to ensure that we have got the best science, we have got the best thinking, and that we're challenging all of our board members to make sure that they truly understand the kind of decisions that they're making on behalf of not just the business, but on behalf of consumers. And that's easier said than done. So one of the big key things for me is have your organizations and have your board members got the skills that they need to be able to act in this space with confidence and make the investments that they need to make. So on healthy and sustainable diets, the big insight and reframing is that most customers don't realize that the biggest impact that they can have on the climate and the environment and indeed water and other things like the people that are involved in those supply chains are the food choices they make. Whether that's, one drink, one plate, one bowl, one meal at a time. And if we can get to the hub of what drives those choices and influence them, then we are a big part of the way. And interestingly, consumers, about 67% of them in a Deloitte survey recently, want to make more active choices in this space, but don't know how. And they are confused and they find the information they're presented with inconsistent. And I can empathize with that totally. And the other thing that's not necessarily well known is that actually it's not as just the foods that you choose, but it's the way that they are produced that have the biggest impact. And when you talk to people, a lot of people use local as a proxy for sustainable. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that local can't be sustainable, but actually when you look at the big impact of farming and food production systems, it is the land use, the crop production, the livestock and the fisheries that are the big impacts. So it is how those things are sourced, not just what is sourced. And again, that was a bit of a light bulb moment for not just our customers, but also for our business. And I think one of the things that's important for us is to make sure that we don't perpetuate some of those myths and that we stick to good scientific evidence and the facts. The other thing that customers didn't really understand was that actually a lot of the things that we have been saying for a long time, like the Eat Well guide, actually do deliver some really big greenhouse gas emission reductions. So on the left, you can see their current nutrition and dietary survey. And basically what it's saying is, as we all know, we're eating too much of dairy products and proteins and not enough fruit and veg, not enough fiber, so on and so forth. But if we were to eat the Eat Well guide, then according to some estimates, that greenhouse gas emissions would reduce, land use would reduce, water use would reduce, and daily disability adjusted life years would increase by nearly 18 million. So just by doing what we've been talking about has a big upside. But of course, every diet in the world has a different national dietary guideline. And I like this chart because what it says is if you look at what those current emissions are, which is the light blue line, these are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the current diets for those nations. And then you look at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the national dietary guidelines of those countries, then actually all of those areas would be in the same position as the UK, that if we were to eat these things, then that would have a positive impact on greenhouse gases. And I know you probably all know this, but this again are things that are blinding insights for those of us that don't. And that led us to something that we talked about, which we describe within our business as making every calorie count, and making sure that if we are going to have those national dietary guidelines and we are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how do we make sure that we don't do that to the detriment of human health? And the reason I say that is, again, because there are some things around what a healthy and sustainable diet look like that aren't necessarily common wisdom, and they are perhaps sometimes counterintuitive. And if you look at the chart that I've just put up, what that shows is the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, processing, transport, packaging, and in a retail store. And that pretty much plays to the graph that I just showed earlier that says that most of this is in the agricultural, most of the footprint is in the agricultural part of the supply chain. And it shows there fruit and veg at the top, meat and meat products, milk and dairy products, grains, and then sweets. That is greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of food. When you start to look at that from a calorie point of view, then things start to change quite differently, because some of those foods are very low energy density foods. And we know that for some of the world, calories themselves are still important because people don't have enough to eat. But it isn't just about the calories, it is about the nutrition within those calories. So if we were then to look at greenhouse gas emissions from a nutrient density point of view, what you can see here is the ND6 along the horizontal axis, and you'd see exactly the same graph if you took the ND15, so the really important nutrients that we all need for a healthy existence. And then you look at the greenhouse gas emissions for those nutrients, then you suddenly start to see quite a different picture. And I suppose what I'm very keen, and was always very keen in my previous role, is to make sure that we are doing the best for human health, planetary health, and whether that's greenhouse gas emissions or nature more broadly. And that means a slightly more nuanced conversation than the one that's happening at the moment.
Judith, sorry, just to interrupt your flow. A couple of people are confused. But what do you mean by processed vegetables? I think processed fruit and veg was an unusual phrase.
Yeah, that basically is things that aren't just fruit and veg. So canned, as in fresh. So canned, frozen, that kind of thing.
Ah, great, thank you.
Yeah. So moving on, the other thing that has always perplexed me, particularly sitting where a retailer would sit in the middle of the value chain. So we've got our suppliers upstream and we have our customers downstream. One of the challenges that we have is that even if tomorrow we could persuade all of our consumers and customers to eat a healthy diet, or indeed the Eat Well guide, then we actually don't produce as a planet the foods that we need to be eating. And that's where we start to talk about things like a fair transition and a just transition. And the other nuance around this is that it is not just about farmers and growers as we know them in the UK, but 35% of the world's food and some of the more basic commodities are grown by smallholder farmers. And these are the farmers that are farming less than 5 acres, earning around $2 a day, and they account for 500 million households globally. And if we don't do the right thing for them, then in that fair and just transition, then we do have a real problem. And that could be the whole subject of another lecture at some point. And then I suppose the last plea is, you know, for us, wherever we are in the system, people will look to us for guidance. And that's why this alignment that I talked about in getting from knowing to doing is so important. If the experts can't agree, then it's no wonder that customers find things confusing. And even though they want to make those more informed choices, they really don't know who to listen to. So, and won't go into all of the conversations, because this is what LEAP is all about, is getting to that best truth on meat, on dairy, and what that means for livestock in regenerative and proactive food and farming systems. But I will leave you with that one. Second part of all of this is the tools to do the job. So imagine we've got this amazing alignment on what it is we need to do. How on earth are we going to implement it well at pace and scale? And for me, that is it's processes, it's business processes, it's ways of working, but it's also standardized management information, metrics and reporting. And I kind of summarize this as saying, are we speaking the same language, and are we using the same currency to talk about how we are implementing these things and our performance in implementing these things? So, you know, the collection of data and data that is standardized data through intelligent agriculture. Where are those additional data requirements, and how can we collect those through existing channels rather than creating new ones? And anyone of you who's working in this space at the moment will know it's a bit like the Wild West. There are lots and lots of ways of doing this. But the channels that we collect that data in, you know, where are they going to sit? Who is going to own that data? And how are we going to ensure that data is democratized and used for the public good? And then from a business, again, like a food business like Sainsbury's, aligning the product and supplier and approval processes and the procurement processes to these new ways of working to ensure that there is real transparency and visibility is key. So data standards and reporting, again, a whole topic in itself, but how do we make sure that we can capture those things? How can we make sure that data is inoperable? How can we classify that data so that comparisons between products and services can be made so that consumers can make sustainable choices? And how do we turn that into something from a labeling point of view in much the same way we did on nutrition labeling all those years ago, to ensure that those customers that want to can make those choices? And also, how do we build the business case? Because without the data, it's really difficult to put a business case in front of a board of directors to say, this is why we should do X. Here is the investment that's required. Here is the impact it will have. Here is the full business value of this. And this is why it's worth investing in this project. And again, I won't go through all of this, and you can have the slides at the end, which I know will be shared. But what a connected business framework really looks like for healthy, sustainable diets and for businesses to make the investments in the right place is absolutely key. Because for many of these interventions, historically, we would have looked at them in a very binary way. We do this, it has this impact, here's the investment, here's the return. But this is such an interconnected, interdependent system that we place one intervention, and that intervention may have multiple benefits. And again, go back to something like food waste. There is the value of the food that is wasted, but it's the value of all of the resources upstream and those sunk resources. Those are costs that have already been paid. That's labor, it's transport, it's all sorts of other things that are also wasted. But those things are never put into the business case because it's difficult to define that business case. So I will leave you with that thought on the connected business case and the unintended benefits on co-benefits of single interventions. And then moving on to KPIs, targets and incentives, quite often this is where businesses start. So you'll see multiple commitments to healthy diets, to sustainable food systems, but without all of the things that have gone before. And that's good, because it's good that people go out there and make a commitment without knowing necessarily how they're going to achieve it. But the process by which you achieve it and the roadmap to achieving those targets and commitments should be known. So how do we ensure the metrics cascade from global to local? How do we lead by example on transparency and disclosure? And how do we work with the system to do all the things that I've just described, so that when we actually get to making targets and commitments, people feel confident? And there's some good news on this. There is quite a lot of work going on harmonisation of standards. And even though every single geography, jurisdiction will have its own challenges, we know we can get quite a high degree of harmonisation on those things. And there's good evidence of that through things like the Consumer Goods Forum, looking at the harmonisation of food safety standards, for example, with the Global Food Safety Initiative. The more that we can achieve that, the easier it makes being part of a global food system, and easier to make those commitments work. The other thing that's happened is that there were multiple reporting boards that the finance sector were using to talk about these things. So whether it was the International Integrated Reporting, the Carbon Disclosure Standards Boards, the Value Reporting Foundation, SASB. One of the good outcomes of COP26 was the announcement on the 3rd of November that the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, has been formed, and that will basically convene and consolidate all of these existing boards into one, so that we truly will have an international language and currency for all of this, which I think is a massive step forward. They don't know how they're going to do it yet, but they're definitely bold and ambitious. And that's important because one of the things that has always troubled me is that whilst we talk about the UK and our performance on reducing greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and we have done really well on that. And if you look at RAP's report of 2019, it showed in the 5 years, 2015 to 2019, greenhouse gases from the food system declined by 8%. If you look at that on a consumption basis, so what are the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with our consumption of goods, and this is all goods, then that really hasn't moved at all. And indeed, if we were going to be extreme, we'd say all we're doing is offshoring our greenhouse gas emissions to other people. Now, when we import around 50% of the food that we eat, that's understandable. But it means that we do have to work at a global level, and we do have to recognise that we are part of a global food system. And then finally, on stakeholder feedback and the stakeholders within the system, how do we make sure that we know we are keeping everyone aligned, that we're all performing and doing our bit as part of this system? And that's surveys, indices from the people you work with, to the people that invest in your business, to customers, to government, NGOs. And how do we do that? And again, there's some really good things out there. They're not exhaustive, but one or two that I've been working with. The first is the World Benchmark Alliance. They are really the go-to place for investors. And this year they launched their Food and Agriculture Benchmark. It's global benchmarking of 350 businesses across 7 different aspects. And basically the benchmark's aim is to give investors the information they need to ask the big global businesses that can make a difference, the right questions, and to act as a provocation, really. And I think it's definitely well worth a look. But like all of these things, it's only as good as the data and the metrics that are in those reports and in those indices. So it all goes back to those first principles. But expect things like this to be commonplace and to enter our language. So in summary, to get from knowing to doing on this requires us to do that first thing that I talked about, and that is establish true understanding, speak the same language, to use the same currency, and be aligned at the outset. It will require us to work differently. It will require us to collect data in a way that we've never collected it before, and that needs to be democratized and interoperable. We need some really ambitious targets, but I don't think that's a problem. If sectors can move like they have on energy and transport, then why can't the food and farming sector? We do require mandatory reporting. People think we don't need it, but we do. We need those open feedback loops that I've just talked about, and we need to work collaboratively and cohesively at pace and scale. So I've galloped through that. If you want some more reading, there's some things there that I've found very helpful in my journey through all of this. And thank you for listening. Back to you.
Judith, thank you so much. Oh my goodness, that was an amazing sort of canter across the food system, and I think the fact that you were able to make it so clear and is really a function of all the time you've spent thinking about it. It is an utterly compelling narrative, but as you said, that challenge is going from knowing that to doing it. And what I think you've done there is set up the roadmap of how you do doing it better. But I guess what I want to press you on, and I think what people in the chat are asking, is whether you can give us some examples of things that would make a difference, that maybe are starting or are not quite happening. So, for example, you know, if you think about our big retailers, what is well, two questions which scoop up one from Charles Godfrey. What could government do that would make it easier for supermarkets to do the right thing? And secondly, what is in a way the big barrier? What's stopping you moving towards this healthier and more sustainable diet? Is that consumers or is that just other business pressures? What is it which is stopping that? So that's two to get us started.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Charles, for your question. Much appreciated. I think we would always talk about creating a level playing field, and from government and what could government do, and what does that mean in practice? What that means is that our lovely nation, and indeed other nations, get their food or they get their calories through lots of different channels. They get their calories through eating out in a McDonald's or a Nando's or wherever it might be. They get their calories through shopping in a supermarket, taking that food home and cooking it and preparing it themselves. They get those calories through increasingly online delivery services from Uber Eats, Just Eat, Deliveroo, so on and so forth. But the rules across all of those channels vary very differently. So the rules, if you're selling packaged food, for example, are very different from the rules if you're selling food that's not packaged. The classic example of that is the new high fat, sugar and salt regulations that are talking about promotions in supermarkets, but those promotions and those guidelines only apply to packaged food. So if I wanted to go and sell donuts at the front of the store and packets of cookies that were baked in our in-store bakery or an in-store bakery and that weren't packaged, then those can be promoted, just as anything else in a small convenience store can be. So unless we create a level playing field, it's really confusing for customers that when they get their food through one channel, one set of rules apply. When they get their food through another channel, another set of rules apply. And it's not just about health and sustainability. The same is true about things like allergens and things that are linked to food safety. That can't be right. So level playing field would be one. And the second one is data. We do not have great data standards around these things. So when we are reported on, and to take something like healthy diets, one of the things that we've been rallying around is, can we have a definition of healthy foods? So when every single person reports on the percentage of their sales from healthy foods, we're talking about the same healthy foods. So I can take every single retailer, and not just retailers, but also food service, and everyone has got a different definition of what healthy is. Some people have defined healthy as non-HFSS foods, which is, it is a definition. Whether it's the best one, I'm not sure. Other people have said, well, we're going to set some criteria around multiple traffic light labels, and we're going to use the multiple traffic lights to create 3 categories: healthy, better for you, and non-healthy foods. And there is every single methodology in between. That requires someone, and I would say the system is not very good at self-organizing. So because we'd all have to compromise. So someone has to say, here is the definition of healthy. This is how you're going to measure it. And by the way, we're going to collect that through your EPOS electronic sales data, which is the way that ONS collects the retail price index. Well, the retail price index is important. So is what is the nation eating important. So why can't we collect that in the same way?
Really
so
interesting.
Data.
So, Judith, that also touches on a comment that somebody else has made about standards. And Bill Jeffrey was saying that the Codex Committee have agreed this year to consider developing global standards on sustainability claims. But what hope do you see for there being, and I'm guessing from your previous comments, maybe not much, for systems which are based on voluntary things? Or do you think we're going to have to move to a mandatory labelling system?
Yeah, I do think that if you could standardize the data, the raw data, and then if I use nutrition as an example, because I remember for years, and it was years, we discussed the definition of fiber. And then when we agreed on the definition of fiber, we discussed the methodologies for the analytical process to establish that fiber content. And that was important, because actually, depending on which definition and which analytical method you used, you got very different results. And that was meaningful. So you can't shortchange these things. You've got to give them time, but you do have to have alignment on it. But if we could get to the point where we had standardized definitions, standardized methodologies, and that won't always be analytical methods, but there will be a number of different methodologies. And you think about the number of carbon calculators, for example, that are out there. I think it's over 400 at the last count. When you think of all of those things, if we could just get alignment on that, then at least if people want to, and again, go back to nutrition, make a claim on a source of vitamin C, or, sorry, my doorbell's now ringing and the dog is barking. If you could get that alignment, then you can start to compare products and services in a way that you can't now. And that means the market is free to do things, but only within a framework.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't want to stifle that. But at the moment, as you know, the Competition and Markets Authority have looked into some of the greenwashing, misleading claims. And quite rightly so, because there's some shocking things out there. And we should all be, indignant about that. So, yeah.
Here's a slightly different question, which is maybe a little bit more philosophical. And this is really thinking about the way we talk about, we talk about government, we talk about companies, we talk about people as though they're all completely separate, unconnected things. But of course, at the end of the day, we're all people. It's just that some people have different responsibilities. Some people have responsibilities in companies and some people have responsibilities in government. Do you think it would be more helpful if we started to consider companies and government as simply composed of people rather than as some sort of either corporate or government entity? And is there something about this idea of us all being citizens in this rather than actually taking on the label of our employer?
I think that's a great question, actually, and I think I agree with much of that. I think if you think that the systems-based approach is the only way to get things done, then we're all part of a process as opposed to a part of an organisational structure. And regulation's quite an interesting one, because if you think about what's coming down the track with things like ELMS with things like deposit return schemes on plastic bottles. These require massive system changes in how we handle waste, how we process things, how we farm the land. It's not the regulator's job to say, here's the regulation, you go off and be compliant. It's about regulators working with regulated industries to say, how is the best way of achieving that, or what is the best way of achieving that, and how do we ensure that there aren't any unintended consequences of that legislation that will come back to haunt us. And waste is a good example, because when the regulation came in years ago on reducing packaging, it was done by weight. And the easiest way to downweight a tin can, a glass bottle, or anything else, because the tax was based on weight, was to put it into lightweight plastic. And that's what everyone did. But actually, if we had consulted on that and aligned ourselves, both the regulator and the regulated, in the first place, then perhaps some of those unintended consequences that we've come back to sort out later might well have been avoided. And I think because it's so complicated, you need a different approach. I'm not suggesting this is the best example, by the way, but the water companies all got together to make what they called a public interest commitment. Which was, how are they going to work in the best interests of the public and citizens on a number of things where essentially they'd all be trying to compete and outdo each other on, pricing or sustainability. Probably mostly price. Because obviously the reason they did this was they'd all got in trouble for various reasons, and that they wanted to show that actually they could work collectively for the greater public good. And I think those sorts of things should be the way that we're thinking about things going forward, because there's so much now that sits in the pre-competitive space, and it needs to, because if it doesn't, we're not going to get these things done. No, I think it's a really good question, and I agree.
Judith, we could talk for absolutely ages, and there's loads of questions, but I'm going to just finish with one. I guess, you've been in the retail sector for years and years and years. I can't imagine actually that you're not going to be there, but I'm sure you have plenty of other things at the Environment Agency and elsewhere to keep you busy. But as you sort of step back from that sort of life, what are the things that are happening in retail that you feel really encouraged by? I think, change that's happening, and you feel, is that plant-based alternative? What is that? And what are the bits that you worry about, that where you just feel either people are putting their head in the sand, or we're just stuck?
Yeah.
No,
I feel very encouraged by what we're doing at a global level. So if you look at something like the Consumer Goods Forum, and they've been going a long time, but they're 450 companies across the food system. So everything from the Cargills, the ADMs, the big global traders, to retailers like Walmart, Alibaba in China, Carrefour across Europe. That group of businesses are doing some really good things. And they're doing really good things on deforestation, transparency on reporting, setting of metrics. They're doing really good things on plastic. So in that sense, I'm really encouraged by the global agenda on this. And the UK and Europe agenda slightly worries me because of the divergence of some of the things that Europe are doing, and we don't quite agree with those things, or we're not aligned on those things, and that's going to cause problems for us, and already is starting that, particularly from a farming perspective. And if you look at the fall of our exports to Europe in that sector, that is of a concern. I also feel encouraged by some of the innovation that's going on. But I do think there are some things in there, and talk about plant-based and further processed foods, that we need to watch out for, and we need to call those things out, because where products are higher in salt, fat, and all sorts of other things, it's not great. So how do you get convenience, but convenience with minimally processed fresh foods? And that's always a challenge because of food waste, because it's you're asking farmers to grow different things and think about different things, and there's always a risk associated with that, which goes back to the world's not producing what the world needs to be eating. But again, I think the dialogue's there, and I think the really big thing is this collective working. It does need a systems approach, and I don't think we've quite nailed who the system is, and making sure we've got the right people in the room to have those conversations in an equitable way. But if we could do that, there's no shortage of willingness. There is no shortage of willingness. We're just not good at organising ourselves, and we need other people to do that for us. And government needs to know when to do that and when to let us get on with it.
So do you see the white paper as in the UK? I mean, we've got people joining us around the world, but in the UK, do you see, England, I guess, do you see the white paper as being that kind of defining moment where we start to organise ourselves?
Yeah, I do. And I'm confident that some of the things that might be in there that we've talked about this morning in terms of definitions and data standards and working collectively with the system to define those things, genuinely, if those things appear in the white paper, and I'm keeping everything
fingers
crossed, that we can move forwards with a bit more energy and pace. Well, no, not energy, actually. There's lots of energy. It's just not being focused in the right way. And I genuinely, there is no shortage of willingness, because everyone wants a better sector, better farming and food sector that's thriving for everyone in the sector.
People are in this business because they care about it. And yeah. Judith, nobody cares more about it than you. You have been an absolute champion.
Thank you.
And one of the people working in industry, but absolutely keeping all of your academic connections and doing a huge amount with government. Thank you for everything you've done. Please don't stop doing it. And we hope you will come back and join us at LEAP next year, when hopefully we can continue the conversation on a more ad hoc basis. But for now, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you for the questions that have come in. And just to say, the next session, you need to follow the link that's on the agenda, which will take you into the next session, where there's some fantastic posters of work that's in progress, much of which is about metrics and data, and we'll speak to many of the points that Judith's raised just now. So for now, gives you a few minutes to go and make yourselves your own cup of coffee or whatever beverage of your choice, and we'll see you again shortly. Once again, to Judith, thank you so much. Bye for now. Bye-bye.